Well, if you want to get your Bibles, we're going to be continuing our study of 1 Peter chapter 3 this morning, and hopefully be able to complete and finish as much of this chapter as possible. We began 1 Peter chapter 3 last week and did not get very far. In fact, we had to finish chapter 2 first, but we looked at the first 4 verses of this chapter. When you read the book of 1 Peter, you're reading a letter that's being written by the Apostle Peter to a group of Christians who are enduring and about to endure even more persecution because of their faith. And it's interesting, as a result of that you have a very practical book. There are a lot of concepts and a lot of principles that are taught here that we need to know and appreciate, and yet there are a lot of practical things to put into our lives, particularly in this chapter. As you begin this chapter in 1 Peter chapter 3, the first 6 verses, God gives instructions to wives and their responsibility in the home. And we looked at those first 4 verses last week, where it talks about the fact in the first verse that wives are to be submissive to their own husbands. And it talks specifically in those first 2 verses about even those husbands who are not Christians. The Christian wives still must be submissive to them in order that they might be won by their conduct in verse 2. And then in verses 3 and 4, he talks about women's adornment, and that it might be not so much a focus on the outward appearance, verse 3, but on the hidden person of the heart, verse 4. And so while we put a lot of emphasis on how we look on the outside, God's more concerned about how we look on the inside. And that's male and female alike. And so God puts the emphasis, 1 Peter 3 and verse 4, on the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. What is it that is very precious in the sight of God? A gentle and quiet spirit. You think about some of our celebrities. You think about some of those people who are frequently on TV. It's hard to find many of them that you would characterize with a gentle and quiet spirit. But what does God expect of us? That's not just women, but that's all of us, is that God is looking on the inside, and our focus needs to be, what is it that is very precious in the sight of God? As husbands, as wives, as we need to teach our children. They don't need to be concerned about what their friends think. They don't need to be concerned about what those other kids at school think. They need to be concerned about what God thinks. What is it that is precious in the sight of God? Not in the sight of man. Look in verse 5. For in this manner, in what manner? Adorning themselves with the hidden person of the heart, adorning themselves with an incorruptible and gentle and quiet spirit. For in this manner in former times, the holy women who did what? Trusted in who? Here were the holy women. Were they concerned about what everybody else was thinking? No. Here were the holy women of old. That doesn't mean old women, but that means holy women who trusted in God. What did they do? They also adorned themselves with what? A gentle and quiet spirit, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. We could spend a whole class right there on those 3 words, right? 3 words, calling him Lord. Did any wives call their husband Lord or Master this morning? Yeah. Oh, Sarah, yeah, Sarah was chuckling as she said it, I'm sure. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, why would she call him Lord? Respect. Does that mean that she called him Lord because Abraham was lording it over his wife and his family? No. It was a sign of respect. By the way, that terminology, look in chapter 5. Talking about elders, chapter 5, verse 2. To elders, shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion but willingly, not for dishonest gain but eagerly, not as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. As Christians, as members of the church, are we to be to take this concept of submission? Are we to be in submission to our elders? Yes. Is that put it back in the context of husbands and wives? Is that because we're to be in submission to them? Is that because they lord it over the flock? No. Go back to the answer that was just given a minute ago. It's because of respect that we have for them. Come back to chapter 3, verse 6. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you what? If you do good and are not afraid with any terror. I pointed this out a few weeks ago, but just to see this again, go back to chapter 2 and verse 14. I want you to see this emphasis that's throughout this book. Chapter 2, verse 14, when it talks about the fact that we are to submit ourselves to governing authorities, it says, or to governors, as to those who are sent by men, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who what? Do good. Verse 15, for this is the will of God, that by what? That by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Look at verse 20, chapter 2, verse 20. What credit is it to you when you are beaten for your faults if you take it patiently? But when you what? Do good and suffer for that. And then we just saw in chapter 3 and verse 6 the emphasis on wives doing good. Look in verse 11. Let them turn away from evil and what? Chapter 3, verse 11. Turn away from evil and do good. Look at verse 17. For it is better if it is the will of God to suffer for what? Doing good than for doing evil. Go to chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 19. Therefore let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to Him in what? Doing good as to a faithful Creator. Throughout this book is an emphasis for citizens, for slaves, chapter 2, verse 20, for wives, chapter 3, verse 6, for all Christians, chapter 3 and verse 11, to do good. What does that mean? Those are simple words. What does it mean for Christians to do good? To do what's right in the sight of God. Not what's right in the sight of men, but to go back and to simply do what's right in the sight of God. The end of verse 6 says, and do so without being afraid, without having any kind of terror. Now, Peter gave 6 verses to wives, and you get to verse 7 and he gives 1 verse to husbands. What's up with that? Why do you give 6 verses to the wives and 1 verse to the husbands? That's all we can handle. It's just an honest answer, right, Chuck? Is it because husbands don't have as much responsibility in the homes as the wives, so we just have a shorter verse? No, you flip over to Ephesians chapter 5, and there's a few more verses for husbands than there are for wives. Look in verse 7. Husbands likewise. That's interesting. Chapter 3, verse 1 started that same way. Wives likewise. Likewise what? Why is he starting chapter 3, verse 7 with the word likewise? Do the same thing you said before. Okay, so you go back to chapter 3, verse 1. Wives likewise. Likewise what? Do the same things that he was saying to do before. Notice the context. Go back to chapter 2, verse 13. To Christians, God says, chapter 2, verse 13, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Chapter 2, verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters. Chapter 3, verse 1, wives likewise, be submissive to your own husbands. Chapter 3, verse 7, husbands likewise. Likewise, what? Are husbands to be submissive as well? Well, how does that work? How can you have a wife who's submissive and a husband who's submissive? I mean, what's the deal with that? I mean, if one's submitting to the other, if they're both submitting to each other, who's in charge? God is. There's a good answer. Hold your finger there. Go back to Ephesians 5 for a minute. We're going to see this exact concept in 1 Peter in just a second, but I want us to make sure we see in Ephesians 5. Ephesians 5 and verse 22. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. It's where we have some similar instructions being given. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church. Verse 28, husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. Verse 33, let the wife see that she respects her husband. There's a lot of emphasis in this chapter, in this section, on the relationship between husbands and wives. Verse 22, Ephesians 5:22 says the same thing 1 Peter 3:1 says. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. But what does verse 21 say? Submit to one another. How do you do that? How does person A submit to person B and person B submit to person A? If you're both submitting, say again? Okay. It's a communication thing. Dirk? Say that again. Okay. It's called marriage. You're fulfilling the role that God has given to you. Tasha?
Maybe it's each one looking out for the good of the other, and that's not mutually exclusive. Each one can look out for the good of the other.
That's right.
It occurred to me also that sometimes the strength of the commands to husbands and wives are things that are more difficult to husbands and wives. Sometimes it may be more difficult for a wife to submit, so they're encouraged to do so more often. And men, being the hunters and gatherers, may find it more difficult to look at the emotional side, so they're encouraged to, think about those emotional things. It occurred to me it's probably not right, but
No, it is right, and that's what Peter's getting at here. Let me comment on that in just a second. Let's come back, this submitting to one another. Soon to be married Mr. Stephen. Have some insight on us for us? Oh, okay. Well, what were you going to say?
But in having read in the past about relationships,
Yes.
I remember someone talking about is to trying to submit and have this relationship to each other, it's like a competition to outlove each other. If each one's trying to outlove the other in your actions towards each other, you're never going to lose. You're going to be competing to outlove, and each way you're winning all the way.
Okay.
I got him stopped.
What?
He's speechless.
Yeah, you got me stumped, right. Okay. Define for me agape love. If agape love is in your home, define for me what that means. It's unconditional. It means it doesn't matter what the other person does. Wives, it doesn't matter what your husband does, you still love him. I'll let that soak in for a second. It doesn't matter what your husband does, it's unconditional, you still love him. Husbands, doesn't matter what your wife does, you still love her. It's unconditional. What else? How else do we describe, is agape love defined? It's selfless. When you have agape love for someone, whose interest are you looking out for? The other person. Whose needs are uttermost, are at the top of the list if you have agape love for someone? The other person. Agape love is selfless. It's not looking out for self, it's looking out for the other person. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter. When I sit down with couples who are planning to get married, one of the things that we talk about is that if the marriage is going to be successful, then agape love has to dominate your marriage. if the husband is doing all that he can to meet his wife's needs and is not trying to meet his needs, he's not selfish. If the husband's doing all he can to meet the wife's needs, and if the wife is doing all that she can, not being selfish, she's doing all that she can to meet the husband's needs, whose needs are being met in that relationship? God's needs and everybody else's needs. Can your needs be met if you're not meeting your needs? Sure they can. That's what marriage is about. That's what agape love is about. If you have not read, who is it, Harley? William Harley's book, His Needs, Her Needs, you need to read it. If you're married. If you're not married and don't plan to get married, it's still a good book. But His Needs, Her Needs describes this very concept of the fact that husbands and wives have different needs, and yet their responsibility is to meet those needs. Come back to this comment that Tasha made. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Some people look at this verse and say, well, this is evidence that God has a sense of humor. Because it says, husbands likewise dwell with your wives, dwell with them with understanding. Some people read that section and say, God's got to have a sense of humor because he's telling the husbands to live with your wives and understand her. How easy is that? It's impossible. One of our elders says, that was Don Dodd, one of our elders, for those who are listening to this recording later, who said that it's impossible. That'll teach you to make a comment in class, Don. Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding what? Dwell with them with understanding. Understanding their needs. How can a husband possibly understand his wife's needs? There's got to be some communication there, right? Is the husband going to figure it out on his own? All the women are shaking their head as hard as they can this way. Husband's not going to figure it out on his own. All right? And Stephen, it doesn't matter how many books we read about women and about wives, we're not going to figure it out even from the books, right? Because if the books don't have pictures, the guys aren't figuring it out anyway. So, husbands are supposed to dwell with their wives with understanding. That means he needs to understand what her needs are, and that needs to be communicated. Could this also be talking about the fact that a husband is to dwell with his wife with an understanding of God's will? With a knowledge of God's will for his role as a husband? Do I need to understand what my responsibility is as a husband? You go back to Ephesians chapter 5. The husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Some people read Ephesians 5:23 and they mock it for being some kind of a male chauvinist kind of a verse that says, well, that's just some guy, that's just Paul writing and saying, the man has to be in charge. No, that's God writing and saying that the man is the head. And I know that some wives look at that and perhaps they look at it with disdain, but husbands ought to look at that with a great deal of humility and fear. That the husband is the head of the house, the head of the home, the head of the wife. Does that come with a lot of responsibility? Yes. Who's responsible for getting that home to heaven? The primary responsibility falls on the husband. Whose responsibility is it for the home to be spiritually focused, to be biblically focused? That's the husband's. Husbands, dwell with your wife with understanding. What do you need to do as a husband? Giving honor to the wife. Anybody have a different word than the word honor in your translation? Respect. See, you read Ephesians 5 and we think, well, it's only the wife who's supposed to, Ephesians 5:23, she's supposed to honor, she's supposed to respect her husband. But here God brings it full circle that the husband, who's the head, he's also to be submissive. The husband who's the head is supposed to dwell with her with understanding. The husband who's the head is to give her honor, praise, respect in the home. Is he lording it over her? Sometimes in wedding ceremonies, I'll use the illustration, and you've heard it used several times, I'm sure, that when God chose to create a helpmeet for Adam, remember what he said? It's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet. Sometimes it is said that God took a bone, but he did not take it from Adam's head in order that she might lord it over him. And he did not take it from his foot in order that he might walk all over her, but he took it from his side, that he might have an undying love for her, that they might walk side by side, hand in hand together. And that's a cute and nice illustration about where God took the bone from to make the woman. But the husband's responsibility, dwell with understanding, give her respect, give her honor, treat her how? Treat her as the weaker vessel. Well, that's offensive, isn't it? Ladies, is that offensive to you? You're not weaker. Let's have an arm wrestling contest, okay? Let's figure this out once and for all. Who's in charge in your home? Who's wearing the pants in your house? The weaker vessel? That's just offensive. Why does God refer to the wife as the weaker vessel? Because she is. Is that physically? Is she physically? I know there's some wives in here who are bigger than their husbands and can, teach them a thing or two. Why is she called the weaker vessel? Is she weaker physically? Husbands, have you ever had to pick something up for your wife? Husbands, have you ever been asked, would you carry this in the house for me? Yes. Have you ever been asked, would you reach up there and get that off of the shelf for me? Husbands ever been asked that? Greg, you've never been asked that, right? She's so much taller than you that, she can reach everything in the house just fine. Notice what God says. Jerry, what? You got a comment? Oh, okay. Lorena, I thought he was going to make a comment. So, anyway, husbands, boy, we're spending a lot of time on this one verse, aren't we? I needed to finish this chapter today. Husbands, dwell with your wives with understanding. Dwell with her, giving her respect, showing her honor and respect as the weaker vessel. Weaker in the sense of physical strength. Weaker in the sense of what else? Anything else that how would you describe the difference between a man and a woman? Can you describe that difference emotionally? What's the problem with guys sometimes when it comes to emotions? We bury them. We shove them down in there and we pack them tight and we don't show them, right? Because we're tough. Now, there's some women who are tough. But are women able to handle things? And I'm not trying to stereotype and I'm not trying to offend anyone. Did you say thank you? Huh? Oh, you didn't open your mouth? You're keeping your mouth shut in this discussion of husbands and wives, aren't you? Smart man. He's dwelling with her with understanding, right? That here are guys who are supposed to be Mr. Tough. Here are guys here are husbands who are supposed to be, as John Gray calls them in Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, he's Mr. Fix-It. He's got it all together and he can handle it. Dwell with your wives with understanding, with respect, as the weaker vessel. Why? Look at the rest of the verse. Not just as a weaker vessel, but understanding that you are heirs together of the grace of life. When God looks at the home, when God looks at husbands and wives, does he see the husband up here and the wife down here? And does he see that he's in charge and that he's going to get a greater reward and that they are on different planes spiritually? Does God look at the home spiritually and say they're on two different levels? God says, here's the husband. He's the head of the home. Here's the wife. She is to submit to her own husband. And underline the word own in verse 1. You don't have to submit to any other husband, ladies, except for your own. Husbands, submit to your own husbands. Husbands, submit to your own husbands. That's good. Wives, submit to your own husbands, as to the Lord. When God looks at them spiritually, when God looks at a husband and wife spiritually, they are joint heirs, to use the terminology from Romans chapter 8. They are heirs together of the grace of life. When you look at your home, on a spiritual plane, everyone needs to be seen as equals. That everybody in that home needs to go to heaven. Everybody in that home needs the encouragement to grow spiritually and to go to heaven. And guys, look at the end of verse 7. If we do not dwell with our wives with understanding, if we do not treat our wife, number these in your head. If we do not dwell with our wives with understanding, if we do not treat them with respect, with honor, with praise, as to the weaker vessel, understanding that we are heirs together of the grace of life, if we don't do that, then what? What's going to happen? Our prayers will be hindered. Is it possible to have a right relationship with God, but not have a right relationship with mankind? And according to verse 7, can I be right with God but not be right with my wife? My prayers will be hindered if I am not the kind of husband that God calls me to be in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. My relationship with God will be hindered. That's serious. These are not just mere suggestions. These are not just, well, I'm not that kind of man. I can't fit into verse 7. That's not me. Tough luck. That's got to be you. God created you and He brought, who joined you together, by the way? Whom God has joined together. When God married the two of you together, He put you in a relationship He knew that you could exist in. And He gave you roles that He knew that you could fulfill if you were willing. But it's not just in marriage. Can we have a right relationship with God if our relationship with mankind, with our brothers and sisters, is not right? If I don't forgive you, is my relationship with God going to be good? Will He forgive me? If I come to worship in Matthew chapter 5, and I know that my brother has something against me, if there's something wrong with me and my brother, what do I need to do? I need to fix that in order that I might have a right relationship with God. Now look at verse 8. Finally, all of you, and this is not finally, the end of the book. It's not like some preachers you've heard where the preacher, says finally and then preaches for another, 30 minutes. That's not finally come to the end of the book. This is finally, let me summarize what I've been saying to this point. Remember what he said. Christians submit to government. Servants submit to masters. Wives submit to husbands. Husbands likewise submit to your wives. And then he gets to verse 8. He'd been talking to specific individuals all along. And then he gets to chapter 3, verse 8, and he says, finally who? All of you. All of you be of one mind. Is it possible that you can be of one mind without submission? Is it possible that everybody in here can be of one mind if there's not some submission, some yielding that's involved? Lance, if we were all going to be of your mind, we decided that Lance, we are all going to be of the same mind as Lance. That'd be a good idea, right? We are all going to be of the same mind as Lance. Who's got to submit? Who's got to yield in that situation? Everybody except for Lance. It's your day. You don't have to do anything. You're in charge. Careful. You're in charge. Everybody's got to submit to you, but that doesn't say that. This says all of you be of one mind. Well, where does that come from? Because then it's Lance has got to submit to us, but we submit to Lance. If we're all of one mind, where does that one mind come from? From God Himself. We are united because we have one Lord. We have one hope. And we're serving one cause. Finally, all of you be of one mind. How should we treat each other? Having compassion. Anybody have a different word than the word compassion? Sympathy. The Greek word there is sympathes. We get the word sympathy. Giving sympathy, having sympathy for one another. That means that you and I, through compassion, need to share this, carefulness of this, we need to share our feelings. Guys, I know that's tough. What are feelings? Some guys, that's a difficult word. Having compassion for one another. Love as brothers. As Christians, we need to be tender-hearted. Does that need to be in the home? Yeah. Does that need to be in the church? Yes. Tender-hearted. Ephesians 4:32 says the same thing. Be courteous. What does the word courteous mean? Anybody have a different word at the end of verse 8? Be friendly. Be humble. You can't be courteous without being humble, can you? Our minds need to be one of tenderheartedness, of compassion, of sympathy, of humility. Verse 9, not returning evil for evil. That's the easy thing to do. Not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, returning blessing. So when I have evil coming my way, when I have reviling coming my way, what am I supposed to return? Blessing. How do you do that? Jesus said, bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. How do you do that? When you're getting dumped on, how do you bless in return, Sky? Oh, you weren't raising your hands. It's all about our submission to God. And we talked about this when we looked in chapter 2 last week, when it says that's exactly what Jesus did. He did not revile in return, but He committed Himself unto the one who judges, chapter 2, verse 23. Knowing, the end of verse 9 says, that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. How are you and I guaranteed an inheritance? How are we guaranteed to inherit a blessing? The only way is if we bless those who do us wrong. Again, it comes back to that, in order to have a right relationship with God, I've got to have a right relationship with mankind. I need to treat others as Jesus would. Here's some people's favorite part of 1 Peter chapter 3, where he quotes from Psalm 34. For he who would love life and see good days. Is that you? Would you like to love life instead of being miserable? Would you like to see good days rather than the miserable, horrible, evil days that seem to be coming around you? Would you like to love life, have a happy life, have a fulfilling life, and see good days? I think that's all of us, and that's why we're here. He who would love life and see good days, what does he need to do? It's interesting, the first thing he says is what? Let him refrain his tongue from evil. Can our tongues get us in trouble? Can our tongues turn a good day into a bad day? Yeah, from the get-go, right? I mean, you can get up and your tongue gets you in trouble at the very beginning of the day, and the rest of your day is shot because of something you said. He who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips. Nothing should come from our tongue or from our lips that is deceitful in any way. What does James chapter 3 say about the tongue? It says, no man can tame it. What does that mean? I mean, it says, it says, the Bible talks about taming animals. No man can tame it. Talks about the fact that it's a little fire and that it's set on fire by hell, and that look at what a great forest a little fire kindles, and we know that. You know, our little tongues can get us in all sorts of big trouble. But if James 3, what is it, verse 6 or verse 7, it says, no man can tame it, what does that mean? Does that mean I don't have to try? Oh, good. God gave me a license to not have to worry about my tongue because He says no man can tame it. Right? So no man can tame it. So, hey, don't worry about it. Just say what you're going to say because nobody can tame it. Is that what James is saying? Why would you have 12 or 13 verses in James chapter 3 about the tongue and the evil of the tongue if in the middle of it God says don't worry about it because nobody can handle it, nobody can tame it anyway? Carol?
You don't tame a wild animal, you control it.
Okay.
You never really take the wildness out of the wild animal.
Okay. Carol says you don't tame a wild animal, you just control it. Who is that? Who's that performing group out in Vegas with the tiger and what happened? What was that, 2 or 3 years ago? Yeah, Siegfried and Roy. And you know, here's these tigers. They had raised them from the very get-go, hadn't they? I mean, here's these animals, and yet there was an instinct in these animals still. And so that's a good point that, you know, we may not be able to tame it entirely, but can we control it? Richard? Yes.
And that's a pretty difficult way to think about your religion. Oh, well, I've got a religion. No, you don't. It's a useless religion.
That's powerful. When you read James 3 about the tongue, go back and read James chapter 1 where it says, he who does not bridle his tongue, his religion is useless. Wait a minute. I thought God said that nobody can tame it, but if I don't control it, if I don't bridle it, my religion is useless. In your line, when you read, no man can tame it, underline the word man. You and I cannot learn to control or tame our tongue by ourselves. Can God tame the tongue? Did Jesus tame His tongue? He must have. He never sinned with it. With God's help, can we learn to control or tame our tongue? Yes. And that's the first step in learning to love life and see good days, is to learn to tame and to control our tongue. The bell's going to get us. I can't believe it. We're going to have to pick up chapter 3, middle of the chapter, next week.